The blood-red sun cast long shadows across Whisper Creek as Josephine Blackwood's boots stirred up dust on the main street. Every step away from her past brought her closer to what she feared most, being known for who she truly was. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory offered what she desperately needed: anonymity in a land where questions were considered impolite and survival took precedence over curiosity. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her worn leather satchel, containing all that remained of her former life: a few garments, a small pouch of coins, and a folded newspaper clipping she couldn't bring herself to burn. The bustling frontier town of Whisper Creek wasn't much, but it had a hotel, a saloon, and most importantly, distance from St. Louis. The setting sun glinted off the windows of Whisper Creek's only hotel, a 3-story wooden structure that had clearly seen better days. Its weathered sign creaked in the evening breeze. Josephine adjusted her plain bonnet, tucking away a stray lock of chestnut hair before ascending the steps to the hotel's entrance. The lobby smelled of tobacco, pine soap, and dust. Behind the desk, a portly man with thinning gray hair barely glanced up from his ledger as she approached. "Room for one," she said, placing a few coins on the counter. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her travel-worn appearance. "Just you, miss, traveling alone?" "Yes." "Just me." She kept her voice level, meeting his gaze with practiced calm. He shrugged, taking the coins and pushing a key across the counter. "Room 8, top of the stairs, end of the hall." Josephine nodded her thanks and climbed the creaking staircase. The room was small but clean: a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a cracked pitcher and bowl, and a small window overlooking the dusty main street below. She placed her satchel on the bed and moved to the window, watching as riders and wagons passed through town in the fading daylight. She would need employment soon. The money she'd managed to bring wouldn't last more than a few weeks. Pulling the newspaper clipping from her satchel, she unfolded it carefully, though she knew every word by heart. The headline stared back at her: "Prominent banker found dead, wife missing." Below it, a smaller subtitle read, "Foul play suspected in death of Harold Westfield." Josephine's hands trembled as she refolded the clipping and tucked it away. She had traveled far, but would it ever be far enough? Dawn broke clear and cool over Whisper Creek. Josephine had slept fitfully, waking at every creak and distant shout. After washing her face in the tepid water from the pitcher, she dressed in her plainest skirt and blouse and pinned her hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her reflection in the small, spotted mirror revealed dark circles beneath her eyes, but there was nothing to be done about those. The dining room of the hotel offered a simple breakfast of biscuits, gravy, and strong coffee. Josephine ate quickly, listening to the conversations around her. Most were about cattle prices, the weather, and complaints about the territorial governor's latest proclamations. No one mentioned St. Louis or Harold Westfield, and no one paid her any particular attention. "Excuse me," she said to the woman clearing tables. "I'm looking for work. Would you know of any positions available in town?" The woman, gray-haired and stoop-shouldered, paused her work. "Doc Morgan's been looking for someone to help at his office. Can you read and write?" "Yes, madam, quite well." "Then you might try there. 2 streets over, white building with green shutters. Can't miss it." Josephine thanked her and finished her coffee. As she stepped outside, the morning bustle of Whisper Creek was in full swing. Wagons rumbled down the street, shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and cowboys lounged outside the saloon, already drinking despite the early hour. The doctor's office was easy to find, just as the woman had described. A small brass plaque beside the door read, "Dr. Charles Morgan, physician and surgeon." Josephine hesitated a moment before knocking firmly on the door. It opened almost immediately, revealing a man in his mid-30s with warm brown eyes and hair the color of wheat. He wore a waistcoat with his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his expression was one of mild surprise. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked. "I hope so," Josephine replied. I was told you might be looking for assistance. I can read and write, keep records, and I'm not squeamish. The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. Direct, aren't you? I appreciate that. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. Come in, we can discuss it. The interior of the doctor's office was surprisingly tidy, with a small waiting area at the front and what appeared to be an examination room visible through a partially open door. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles, books, and medical instruments. I'm Charles Morgan, he said, extending his hand. Josephine Blackwood, she replied, taking his hand briefly. She'd decided to keep her first name. There were enough Josephines in the world that it wouldn't draw attention, but had abandoned her married name of Westfield. Miss Blackwood, I am indeed in need of someone to help manage this office. My last assistant moved to California last month. May I ask about your previous experience? Josephine had prepared for this. I worked for a physician in Springfield for 2 years, she lied smoothly. Before that, I assisted my father with his business correspondence. He was a merchant. Dr. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. And what brings you to Whisper Creek? We're hardly on the main thoroughfare. My father passed away, she said, which wasn't a lie. I decided a change of scenery might help. Something in his expression suggested he sensed there was more to her story, but to her relief, he didn't press. Well, Miss Blackwood, the position involves keeping records, assisting with patients as needed, preparing medicines under my direction, and generally keeping things in order. The hours can be long and irregular. Illness doesn't keep to a schedule, I'm afraid. That's quite all right, doctor. I have no other obligations. The pay is $15 a week. Is that acceptable? It was more than she'd hoped for. Yes, very. When can you start? Immediately, if you'd like. Dr. Morgan smiled, and Josephine noticed for the first time how it transformed his face, creating small lines at the corners of his eyes. Excellent. Let me show you around and we can begin. The morning passed quickly as Dr. Morgan showed Josephine his filing system, introduced her to the various medicines and tinctures on his shelves, and explained his methods for sterilizing instruments. She was grateful for the work, not just for the income, but for the distraction it provided from her thoughts. Just before noon, the door opened and a man entered carrying a young boy who was whimpering in pain. Blood soaked through a makeshift bandage on the child's arm. Doc, the man said urgently, Tommy caught his arm on a nail in the barn. It's torn up bad, doctor. Morgan immediately directed the man to place the boy on the examination table in the back room. Miss Blackwood, I'll need clean water, bandages, and the bottle of carbolic acid from the second shelf. Josephine moved quickly, gathering the supplies. As she entered the examination room, she saw the boy no more than 7 or 8 trying bravely not to cry as Dr. Morgan gently removed the bloodied cloth from his arm. This is Miss Blackwood, Tommy, Dr. Morgan said in a calm, reassuring voice. She's going to help me fix your arm. Can you be brave for us? The boy nodded, his lower lip trembling. Here, Josephine said, placing the supplies on the small table beside Dr. Morgan. Without being asked, she dampened a clean cloth and gently wiped the sweat from the boy's forehead. You're doing wonderfully, Tommy, as doctor. Morgan cleaned and stitched the wound. Josephine assisted silently, anticipating his needs and keeping the boy distracted with quiet questions about his dog and his favorite fishing spot. When it was done, and Tommy had been given a piece of hard candy for his courage, doctor. Morgan walked father and son to the door. When he returned, he looked at Josephine with newfound respect. You said you weren't squeamish, but you didn't mention you were good with patients. She shrugged slightly. Children respond well when you treat them like people rather than problems. Indeed they do. He studied her for a moment. I think you'll do very well here, Miss Blackwood. Over the next few weeks, Josephine settled into a routine. She arrived at the doctor's office early each morning, organized the day's appointments, and assisted Dr. Morgan with everything from minor injuries to the occasional childbirth. In the evenings, she returned to her room at the hotel, where she would read by lamplight until exhaustion overtook her. She kept to herself in town, politely declining invitations to socials and church gatherings. The less people knew about her, the better. Still, she couldn't help noticing how Dr. Morgan Charles, as he'd asked her to call him when they were alone in the office, seemed to watch her sometimes with a curious expression. One evening, as they were finishing a particularly long day that had included setting a cowhand's broken leg, Charles leaned against his desk with a weary sigh. "You know, Josephine, you've been here nearly a month and I still know almost nothing about you." She busied herself with organizing instruments that were already perfectly arranged. "There's not much to tell. I find that hard to believe." His voice was gentle without accusation. "Everyone has a story. Mine isn't particularly interesting," she replied, still not meeting his eyes. "Would you join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant tonight?" he asked suddenly. "As colleagues, of course." Josephine finally looked up, surprised by the invitation. Her instinct was to refuse. Keeping her distance was safer. But after weeks of solitude, the thought of companionship, even just for an evening, was tempting. Yes, all right," she found herself saying. Charles smiled, that warm expression that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "Excellent. Shall we say 7 o'clock? Josephine returned to her room with just enough time to change into her one good dress, a deep blue cotton with a modest neckline and minimal trimming. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up more carefully than usual, allowing a few soft curls to frame her face. As she fastened a simple silver locket around her neck, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept, she caught herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in a long time: anticipation. The hotel's small restaurant was half full when she descended the stairs. Charles was already waiting, dressed in a clean shirt and his best waistcoat, his usually unruly hair neatly combed. He stood when he saw her, and something in his expression made her cheeks warm. "You look lovely," he said simply as he pulled out her chair. "Thank you," she replied, unused to compliments after so long. They ordered a beef stew that was the hotel's specialty, and as they waited, Charles kept the conversation light, telling her about growing up in Ohio and his medical training in Philadelphia. He had a gift for storytelling, punctuating his tales with self-deprecating humor that made her laugh despite herself. "What about you?" he asked as they finished their meal. "You mentioned Springfield before. Is that where you grew up?" Josephine had prepared for such questions, had rehearsed her story countless times. "No, I was born in Cincinnati. My father moved us to Springfield when I was 12, after my mother died." "I'm sorry about your mother," Charles said, his expression genuinely sympathetic. "And your father, you said he passed recently?" 2 years ago, she said, which was true. What she didn't say was that her father had died, never knowing what had become of her after she'd married Harold Westfield and moved to St. Louis. "No siblings?" She shook her head. "No, it's just me." Charles seemed to sense her discomfort with the topic. "Well, I'm glad just you found your way to Whisper Creek. You've been a godsend at the office. Mrs. Peterson told me yesterday that you have the gentlest hands in the territory when it comes to bandaging her arthritis." Josephine smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "Mrs. Peterson is too kind. I simply follow your instructions. You do far more than that." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "You have a natural way with people, Josephine. You make them feel at ease even when they're frightened or in pain. That's a rare gift." The sincerity in his voice made her uncomfortable. She didn't deserve his admiration if he knew the truth about her. She looked down at her plate. "I should probably retire," she said softly. "It's been a long day." Charles nodded, though she thought she saw disappointment flicker across his face. "Of course, may I walk you to your room?" "That's not necessary, it's just upstairs." "Humor me," he said with a small smile. "My mother raised me to be a gentleman." They walked up the stairs in silence, stopping when they reached her door. Josephine turned to thank him for dinner, but the words caught in her throat when she saw the way he was looking at her with a warmth and interest that both thrilled and terrified her. "Thank you for joining me tonight," he said quietly. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." She knew she should refuse. Getting close to anyone was dangerous, but looking into his kind eyes, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that." His smile was like sunrise. "Good night, Josephine." "Good night, Charles." As she closed her door, Josephine leaned against it, her heart pounding. She was playing with fire and she knew it. But for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she felt something other than fear and guilt. It was a dangerous feeling, but she couldn't quite bring herself to regret it. The summer heat settled over Whisper Creek like a heavy blanket. Josephine had been working for Dr. Morgan for nearly 3 months, and despite her best intentions, she found herself growing comfortable in the small frontier town. People greeted her by name on the street now, and she'd finally moved from the hotel into a small room behind the millinery shop that was cheaper and more private. Charles had become, not just her employer, but her friend. They often shared meals after long days at the office, and sometimes on Sundays he would invite her to join him for a walk along the creek that gave the town its name. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd seen, and his plans to expand the medical practice. Josephine was careful to keep the conversation away from her past, and Charles, with a sensitivity that touched her, seemed to understand and rarely pressed. But as June turned to July, Josephine began noticing changes in the way he looked at her lingering glances, the brush of his hand against hers when they worked side by side. And worse, she found herself responding, her pulse quickening when he entered a room, her thoughts straying to him in quiet moments. It was on one of their Sunday walks, as they sat beneath a cottonwood tree watching the creek's gentle flow, that everything changed. "I've been thinking," Charles said, idly twirling a blade of grass between his fingers. "The practice has been doing well. I've saved enough to build a proper house on that plot of land at the edge of town." "That's wonderful," Josephine replied, genuinely pleased for him. "You've outgrown those rooms above the office." "I have," he agreed. "And I've been thinking about other things I've outgrown as well." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Like what?" she asked cautiously. Charles turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Like living alone. Like pretending that what I feel for you is simply friendship or professional regard." Josephine's heart began to race. "Charles, please let me finish," he said gently. "I know you keep secrets, Josephine. I know there are parts of your past you don't want to share. And I respect that, but I need you to know that whatever those secrets are, they don't change how I feel about you." "You can't possibly know that," she whispered, her throat tight. "I know your character," he insisted. "I've seen you with patients, with children, with the elderly. I've watched you work tirelessly without complaint. I've seen your compassion and your strength." He reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "I'm falling in love with you, Josephine Blackwood, and I hope that you might feel something for me as well." Tears pricked at her eyes. This was everything she'd feared and secretly longed for. "Charles, you don't understand. There are things about me that you can tell me when you're ready," he finished for her, "or never if that's what you need. But don't push me away because you're afraid of a past I might not understand. Give us a chance." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't deserve a chance." Charles gently wiped the tear away with his thumb. "Why don't you let me be the judge of that?" And then, with infinite tenderness, he leaned forward and kissed her. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, and for a moment, Josephine allowed herself to forget everything but the feel of him, the scent of him, the rightness of being in his arms. When they broke apart, she kept her eyes closed, afraid of what she might see in his face or what he might see in hers. "Josephine," he murmured, "look at me." Slowly, she opened her eyes. His expression was one of such tenderness that it nearly broke her heart. "I'm not asking for promises," he said. "Just don't run away, not yet." She should have said no. She should have ended it there before it went any further. But looking into his eyes, Josephine found she couldn't form the words. Instead, she nodded slightly, and when he smiled and kissed her again, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she could have him despite everything. The summer progressed, and with it, Josephine's relationship with Charles deepened. They were discreet frontier towns thrived on gossip, and Josephine was still protective of her privacy, but it became common knowledge that the doctor and his assistant had formed an attachment. Most people in town seemed pleased, Doctor. Morgan was well respected, and while Josephine was still somewhat of a mystery, her competence and kindness had earned her a measure of acceptance. Charles didn't press Josephine about her past, but he did speak more openly of a future. His house was under construction, and though he never said it directly, the implication was clear. He was building it for both of them. The guilt gnawed at her constantly. Every sweet word from Charles, every tender touch, felt like something stolen, something she had no right to. But still, she couldn't bring herself to leave. For the first time since that terrible night in St. Louis, she had found someone worth holding on to. It was a sweltering August evening when the past finally caught up with her. Josephine was alone in the office, finishing the day's records while Charles made a house call at her ranch outside of town. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up with her professional smile in place. "How can I help?" The words died in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man she recognized instantly, though she'd only seen him in newspaper illustrations. Detective James Harker of the St. Louis Police Department, known for his relentless pursuit of criminals and his perfect record of arrests. "Mrs. Westfield," he said, removing his hat. "Or is it Miss Blackwood now? I've been looking for you for quite some time." Josephine's mouth went dry. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her skirts. "How did you find me?" Harker stepped further into the office, closing the door behind him. "A banker in Denver recognized you from the newspaper sketches when you exchanged some bonds. He telegraphed St. Louis and well." He shrugged. "Here I am." Josephine's mind raced. Charles wouldn't be back for hours. She could run, but where, and for how long? She was tired of running. "What happens now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Now you come back to St. Louis with me to face trial for the murder of your husband, Harold Westfield." The words hung in the air between them, stark and damning. "I didn't kill him," she said quietly. Harker's expression was skeptical. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Mrs. Westfield. Your fingerprints on the letter opener found in his chest. Your disappearance the night of the murder. The life insurance policy he'd recently taken out naming you as beneficiary." "I found him already dead," Josephine said, the memories flooding back. "I pulled the letter opener out without thinking that's why my fingerprints were on it, and I ran because I knew how it would look." "A jury might be interested in that story," Harker said, though his tone suggested he wasn't. "We'll leave on tomorrow morning's stage. I suggest you use tonight to put your affairs in order." The detective left after extracting her promise not to flee, though they both knew there was nowhere for her to go now. Josephine sat at her desk long after he'd gone, staring at nothing, her mind a whirl of panic and despair. How could she tell Charles? What would he think of her? Even if he believed she hadn't killed Harold, and why should he when all the evidence pointed to her guilt? The scandal would ruin him. A respected doctor couldn't be associated with a woman accused of murdering her husband. By the time Charles returned, the sun had set, and Josephine had lit the lamps in the office. She heard his horse outside, the familiar sound of his boots on the boardwalk. The door opened, and there he was, looking tired but pleased to see her. "You didn't have to wait," he said, hanging his hat on the rack by the door, "though I'm glad you did." He crossed to her desk and leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Mrs. Reynolds had her baby a healthy boy. They're naming him Charles." He grinned, but his smile faded as he took in her expression. "Josephine, what's wrong?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "I need to tell you something." Charles pulled up a chair and sat across from her, his face serious now. "What is it?" A detective from St. Louis found me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's taking me back tomorrow to stand trial." Charles's face paled. "Trial for what?" Josephine closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. When she opened them, she forced herself to look directly at him. "For the murder of my husband." The shock on his face was like a physical blow. "Your husband?" His name was Harold Westfield. "He was a banker in St. Louis. I was married to him for 3 years." The words came in a rush now, as if a dam had broken. He was found dead in his study last October, stabbed with a letter opener. I found him, but I didn't kill him, Charles. I swear I didn't. But all the evidence points to me and I ran, and that made it worse. And now, slow down, Charles said, reaching for her hands across the desk. His touch steadied her. Start from the beginning, tell me everything. So she did. She told him about marrying Harold at 19, thinking she was fortunate to catch the eye of such a prosperous man. She told him about Harold's charm in public and his cruelty in private, the subtle humiliations, the control of her every movement, the way he'd isolate her from friends and family. She told him about the night she'd found Harold in his study, already dead, blood pooling beneath him. I pulled the letter opener out. It was instinct, a stupid, foolish instinct. Then I realized how it would look. Me, alone with him, his blood on my hands, the life insurance. She shook her head. I panicked. I took what money I could find, some jewelry I could sell, and I ran. I've been running ever since. Charles had listened without interruption, his expression grave but not condemning. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Do you believe me? She finally asked, her voice small. Yes, he said without hesitation. I believe you. The simple certainty in his voice nearly undid her. How can you be so sure? Because I know you, Josephine. I've seen your soul in 1,000 small moments over these past months. You're not capable of murder. Tears spilled down her cheeks. It doesn't matter what you believe. The evidence is circumstantial, Charles interrupted, and we'll fight it. I'm coming with you to St. Louis. No, she said immediately. You can't. Your practice, your reputation mean nothing to me compared to you. His grip on her hands tightened. I love you, Josephine. I'm not going to let you face this alone. If you knew what I've done, you'd hate me, she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since the moment she'd begun to care for him. Charles stood then, removing his hat and setting it on the desk between them. I know what you've done, he said gently. You survived. You protected yourself. You built a new life. None of that makes me hate you. None of that makes me love you any less. The tenderness in his voice broke something inside her, and Josephine began to sob deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. Charles moved around the desk and gathered her into his arms, holding her as years of fear and guilt poured out of her. When her tears finally subsided, he tilted her face up to his. We'll face this together, he promised. Whatever comes. As dawn broke over Whisper Creek the next morning, Josephine and Charles waited for the stage that would take them east. Detective Harker stood a short distance away, watching them carefully, but allowing them these final moments in the town that had briefly been their home. Are you sure about this? Josephine asked Charles for the 100th time. It's not too late to change your mind. I've never been more sure of anything, he replied, his arm steady around her waist. We'll find the truth, Josephine, and when this is over, we'll come back here and build that life we've been talking about. She wanted to believe him. She wanted it with every fiber of her being. But as the stagecoach appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust in the golden morning light, fear clawed at her heart once more. I'm scared, she admitted. Charles turned to her then, taking both her hands in his. I know, but you're not alone anymore. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. And you never will be again. The stage rolled to a stop before them, and Detective Harker approached. It's time, Mrs. Westfield. Charles helped Josephine into the coach, then climbed in after her, sitting close beside her as Harker took the seat opposite. As the stage lurched forward, beginning the long journey that would take them back to St. Louis, and whatever fate awaited her there, Josephine felt Charles's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. She didn't know what would happen when they reached St. Louis. She didn't know if she could prove her innocence or if she would spend years or the rest of her life in prison for a crime she didn't commit. But for the first time since that terrible night, she wasn't facing her fears alone. And somehow, that made all the difference. The journey to St. Louis was long and grueling. They traveled by stagecoach to the nearest railroad station, then by train across the vast expanse of the country. Detective Harker remained vigilant throughout, though he wasn't unkind. He allowed Charles and Josephine to sit together, to speak privately, and even seemed to develop a grudging respect for the doctor's unwavering loyalty. During the long hours on the train, Josephine filled in the gaps of her story for Charles, telling him about her childhood in Cincinnati, her father's mercantile business that had failed after her mother's death, and how Harold Westfield had seemed like salvation to a 19-year-old girl with few prospects and a sickly father to support. He was charming at first, she explained as they watched the landscape roll by outside the train window. Attentive, generous. It wasn't until after we were married that I began to see another side of him. What changed? Charles asked, his voice low so that Harker, dozing across the aisle, wouldn't hear. Little things at first. He'd criticize what I wore, how I spoke, who I spent time with. Then he began to control our finances completely. I had to ask for every penny, account for every purchase. He isolated me from the few friends I'd made in St. Louis. When my father died, he wouldn't even allow me to attend the funeral. Charles's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. The last year was the worst. He'd become involved with some businessmen, politicians, I'm not sure exactly. There were meetings in our home that I wasn't allowed to attend. Harold seemed anxious, drinking more than usual. Sometimes I'd overhear arguments about investments, about money that was missing. You think his death was connected to these business dealings? Josephine nodded. I do. The night he died, he'd had a visitor, a man I'd seen at the house before, though I didn't know his name. They argued in Harold's study. I was upstairs, but I could hear their voices rising. Then there was silence, and I heard the front door close when I went downstairs to check on Harold. She closed her eyes, the memory still vivid. That's when I found him. Charles covered her hand with his. Did you tell the police about this visitor? There was no opportunity. I fled that night, and by the time the body was discovered the next morning, I was already on a train heading west. We'll need to find this man, Charles said thoughtfully. He could be the key to clearing your name. Josephine gave him a sad smile. How? I don't know his name, only that he was tall with a distinctive scar along his jaw, and it's been nearly a year. He could be anywhere. St. Louis isn't that large a city, Charles said, and men with distinctive scars tend to be remembered. We'll find him, Josephine, I promise you that. She wanted to believe him. Charles's certainty was a balm to her fears. But as the train carried them ever closer to St. Louis and the reckoning that awaited her there, doubt continued to gnaw at her heart. St. Louis had grown since Josephine had fled it 10 months earlier. The city sprawled along the Mississippi, its streets bustling with commerce, its skyline punctuated by church spires and factory smokestacks. As they disembarked from the train, Josephine pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, though the August heat was stifling. I've arranged for you to stay at the Central Hotel tonight, Detective Harker informed them. Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the courthouse for your arraignment. Don't get any ideas about leaving the city, Mrs. Westfield. I've alerted the hotel staff, and there will be an officer outside your door. We understand, Charles replied before Josephine could speak. Thank you for the consideration of the hotel rather than the jail, Harker shrugged. Judge Thornton prefers to keep women out of the city jail when possible, especially women of your social standing. He looked at Josephine with what might have been a hint of sympathy. The press will be at the courthouse tomorrow. They've been following this case since it happened. Be prepared for that. The Central Hotel was modest but clean, situated near the courthouse in the heart of the city. Charles insisted on a room for himself adjacent to Josephine's, despite Harker's raised eyebrows at the expense. I'll be right next door, Charles told her as they stood in the hallway outside their rooms. Try to rest. Tomorrow will be difficult, but we'll get through it together. Josephine nodded, though sleep seemed impossible. Charles, she said softly, thank you for believing in me, for being here. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. He touched her cheek gently. There's nothing to repay. This is what people do when they love each other. They stand together through the hardest times. The word love still made her heart skip. How was it possible that this good, honorable man could love her with all her secrets and her troubled past? "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and right. Charles smiled, that warm smile that had first captured her heart in Whisper Creek. "Then we'll be all right," he said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. "No matter what happens tomorrow, we'll face it together." The courthouse was imposing, a granite structure with towering columns and broad steps leading to massive wooden doors. A crowd had gathered outside, just as Harker had warned, and the murmur of voices rose to a buzz as Josephine, Charles, and the detective approached. "That's her," someone shouted. "The Westfield widow," reporters pressed forward, shouting questions. Charles put his arm protectively around Josephine's shoulders, guiding her through the throng. She kept her eyes down, trying to ignore the hostile stares and whispered accusations. Inside, the courthouse was cool and dim after the bright August sunlight. They were led to a small anteroom to wait for the arraignment to begin. Josephine sat rigid on a hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You'll be asked to enter a plea," Harker explained. "Not guilty, I presume. Judge Thornton will then set a trial date and determine if bail is appropriate." "Can she afford bail?" Charles asked quietly. Harker shook his head. "The court usually denies bail in murder cases, especially where flight is a concern, given that Mrs. Westfield has already fled once." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't fully considered that she might be held in jail until the trial. The thought of being separated from Charles, of being locked away with her fears and regrets, was almost more than she could bear. As if sensing her distress, Charles took her hand, his thumb brushing reassuringly across her knuckles. "One step at a time," he murmured. "Let's see what the judge decides." The courtroom was packed when they entered. Josephine felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as she walked to the defendant's table. A court-appointed attorney waited for them, a young man with spectacles and an air of nervous energy. "Mrs. Westfield," he greeted her with a brief nod. "I'm Herbert Grant. I'll be representing you today." "Actually," Charles interrupted, "we'll be securing our own legal representation. Mr. Grant, we appreciate your willingness to step in for the arraignment, but after that, we'll be making other arrangements." Grant looked surprised but not displeased. "As you wish, sir." The arraignment is fairly straightforward in any case. The proceedings began with the bang of a gavel. Judge Thornton, a stern-faced man with thick white side whiskers, called the court to order. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man named Calvert, read the charges in a ringing voice that seemed to echo in Josephine's ears. "Josephine Elizabeth Westfield, you are charged with the murder of Harold James Westfield on the night of October 18, 1875. How do you plead?" Josephine rose on unsteady legs. "Not guilty, Your Honor." There was a murmur throughout the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Given the serious nature of the charges and the defendant's previous flight from justice, the state requests that bail be denied. Prosecutor Calvert continued, "Mr. Grant offered a token protest, arguing that Josephine had voluntarily returned to face the charges, a stretching of the truth that made Josephine wince. But his heart didn't seem to be in it. Judge Thornton considered for only a moment before rendering his decision. Bail is denied. The defendant will be remanded to the custody of the St. Louis Women's Detention Center until trial, which is set for September 20th of this year. Court is adjourned. The gavel banged again, and Josephine felt her knees weaken. Charles caught her elbow, supporting her as she swayed. 3 weeks, he whispered. "We have 3 weeks to prepare. I'll visit you every day. And I'll find us the best lawyer in St. Louis." Josephine barely heard him. She was watching as a female guard approached to escort her to the detention center. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She was going to jail, possibly for the rest of her life, for a crime she hadn't committed. "Charles," she gasped, suddenly desperate. "Charles, I can't." "You can," he said firmly, gripping her shoulders and looking directly into her eyes. "You are the strongest person I know, Josephine. 3 weeks, that's all we need to endure. I'll be working every minute to find the truth. Trust me." The guard was beside them now, waiting impatiently. Josephine took a deep breath, drawing strength from Charles's unwavering gaze. "I trust you," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it completely. As the guard led her away, Josephine looked back once. Charles stood in the center of the emptying courtroom, his expression a mixture of determination and love. She carried that image with her as she was escorted from the courthouse to the waiting prison wagon, clinging to it like a talisman against the darkness that threatened to engulf her. The St. Louis Women's Detention Center was a grim, three-story building of gray stone and iron bars. Inside, Josephine was processed with mechanical efficiency, her few possessions taken, her measurements recorded, her body searched in a humiliating procedure that left her feeling stripped of more than just her clothing. She was issued a coarse gray dress and led to a cell on the second floor. The cell was small, with a narrow cot, a washstand, and a chamber pot. A barred window high on the wall let in a rectangle of light that did little to dispel the gloom. Josephine sat on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't alone for long. A guard appeared with another woman, a hard-faced matron who introduced herself as Mrs. Briggs. "You're the Westfield widow," Mrs. Briggs stated, her small eyes assessing Josephine coldly. "We don't get many society ladies in here. Most of our guests are streetwalkers and thieves." Josephine said nothing, which seemed to irritate the matron. "Think you're better than them, do you? Better than me? Well, let me tell you something, Mrs. Westfield in here, you're just another prisoner. Your fine manners and fancy education won't help you. You killed your husband for his money, plain and simple, and now you'll pay the price." "I didn't kill my husband," Josephine said quietly. Mrs. Briggs laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "That's what they all say. Innocent as newborn babes, every one of them." She turned to leave, then paused at the cell door. "Dinner's at 6, lights out at 8, any trouble from you and you'll regret it." Left alone again, Josephine closed her eyes, fighting against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Charles, of his steady presence and unwavering belief in her. She had to be strong for his sake as much as her own. The days passed with excruciating slowness. Josephine quickly learned the rhythms of prison life, the clanging bells that signaled meals and exercise periods, the shouts and sobs that echoed through the corridors at night, the petty tyrannies of the guards, and the unwritten rules among the inmates. Most of the other women avoided her at first, viewing her with suspicion and resentment. The newspapers had portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer who had married a wealthy man for his money, and then murdered him when she grew tired of him. To the other inmates, many of whom came from desperate poverty, Josephine seemed the worst kind of criminal, one who had everything and still wanted more. Only one prisoner made any effort to be kind, a young woman named Lily, imprisoned for theft, who shared her table in the dining hall on Josephine's third day. "Don't mind the others," Lily said as she picked at her unappetizing stew. "They're just jealous because you've got a handsome doctor visiting you every day. Is he your sweetheart?" Josephine was startled by the direct question, but there was something refreshingly honest about Lily's manner. "Yes," she admitted. "Though I've told him repeatedly that he shouldn't tie himself to someone in my situation." Lily snorted. "Men never listen, especially when they're in love." She studied Josephine curiously. "Did you really do it? Kill your husband?" "No," Josephine said firmly. "I found him already dead." Lily seemed to consider this. "I believe you," she said finally. "You don't have the eyes of a killer. I should know my pa was one and my brother too." Josephine was touched by the simple declaration of faith from this stranger. "Thank you, Lily." The younger woman shrugged. "Don't thank me. Just tell your doctor to hurry up and get you out of here. This place will wear you down if you let it." Charles visited every day, as promised. They were allowed to meet in a small room under the watchful eye of a guard, their conversations necessarily guarded. But even these brief, constrained meetings were a lifeline for Josephine. "I've hired a lawyer," Charles told her on his second visit. Jonathan Cooper. He's expensive, but he's got a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning them. How can you afford him? Josephine asked, concerned. Charles took her hand across the table, ignoring the guard's disapproving frown. Don't worry about that. I've been saving for years, and my practice in Whisper Creek was doing well. Besides, what better use for money than saving the woman I love? The casual way he referred to his love for her still had the power to make her heart race. Charles, don't, he interrupted gently. Don't tell me again that I should leave you to face this alone. It's not going to happen. Josephine squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. What's Mr. Cooper's plan? He's investigating Harold's business associates. Your theory about the argument you overheard might be our best lead. Cooper has connections in the banking community. He's trying to find out if Harold was involved in anything illegal, anything that might have given someone a motive to kill him. What about the man with the scar? Josephine asked. Have you found any trace of him? Charles's expression grew more serious. Not yet, but Cooper's hired a private detective to look into it. We're not giving up, Josephine. On the day before the trial was set to begin, Charles arrived at the detention center with Mr. Cooper in tow. Jonathan Cooper was older than Josephine had expected, in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being in control of any situation. Mrs. Westfield, he greeted her, taking the seat opposite her in the visiting room. Dr. Morgan has told me a great deal about you. I want you to know that I believe in your innocence, and I intend to prove it to the jury. Thank you, Mr. Cooper, Josephine replied. But I understand the evidence against me is substantial. Circumstantial evidence, Cooper corrected. And circumstantial evidence can be countered with a compelling alternative narrative, which is what we intend to provide. He opened his briefcase and removed a folder. We've been investigating your husband's business dealings in the months before his death. It appears he was involved in some questionable investment schemes with several prominent men in the city, including Councilman George Preston and Judge William Holloway. Josephine's eyes widened. Judge Holloway? He was at our house several times for dinner, Cooper nodded. We believe your husband was embezzling from their joint investment fund. Several large sums were withdrawn in the weeks before his death and deposited in a separate account under a false name. Harold was stealing from his partners. Josephine was stunned. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined. It gets worse, Charles said grimly. Tell her about Preston, Mr. Cooper. The lawyer's expression darkened. Councilman Preston is known to have connections to certain criminal elements in the city. He's been investigated several times for corruption, though nothing has ever been proven. And he paused significantly. He has a distinctive scar along his jawline, the result of a knife fight in his younger days. Josephine's heart began to pound. That's him. That's the man who was arguing with Harold the night he died. We think so too, Cooper said. But we need more than suspicion to convince a jury. We need evidence linking Preston to the scene of the crime. What kind of evidence? Josephine asked. Ideally, a witness who saw him enter or leave your home that night, or physical evidence placing him in your husband's study. Without that, we'll focus on establishing motive and opportunity and creating reasonable doubt about your guilt. Josephine felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by realism. And if that's not enough, if the jury still believes I'm guilty, Cooper didn't sugarcoat his response. Then you'll likely be convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We have a strong case for reasonable doubt, and that's all we need. As the guards signaled that their time was up, Charles leaned across the table. Have faith, Josephine. Tomorrow is just the beginning of clearing your name. She nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. As she was led back to her cell, Josephine found herself praying for the first time in years not for herself, but for Charles, who had staked everything on her innocence. Whatever happened tomorrow, she couldn't bear to see him disappointed. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Journalists filled the press section, their pencils poised over notepads. The public gallery was standing room only, filled with curious citizens eager for a glimpse of the Black Widow of St. Louis, as the newspapers had dubbed Josephine. She sat beside Mr. Cooper at the defense table, wearing a simple gray dress that Mrs. Briggs had grudgingly allowed Charles to bring her. Her hair was neatly arranged, her posture straight, but she felt as if she might shatter at any moment. Charles sat directly behind her in the first row, his presence a tangible comfort at her back. Judge Thornton called the court to order, and Prosecutor Calvert rose to deliver his opening statement. His voice rang through the courtroom as he painted a damning picture of Josephine as a cold, calculating woman who had married Harold Westfield for his money and killed him when she grew impatient for her inheritance. The evidence will show, Calvert concluded, that on the night of October 18, 1875, the defendant stabbed her husband through the heart with a letter opener from his own desk, took what valuables she could carry, and fled the city. These are not the actions of an innocent woman, ladies and gentlemen, but of a guilty one who knew exactly what she had done. When it was Cooper's turn, he approached the jury with a measured confidence that seemed to command attention. "My learned colleague has presented you with a simple story," he began, "but the truth is rarely simple. The evidence will show that Harold Westfield was involved in illegal financial schemes that had made him powerful enemies. It will show that on the night of his death, he had a visitor, a business associate with whom he had argued violently. And it will show that Josephine Westfield, far from being a cold-blooded killer, was a frightened young woman who found her husband already dead and fled because she feared she would be blamed." The prosecution called its witnesses, first the maid who had discovered Harold's body the morning after the murder, the police detective who had investigated the scene, the coroner who had determined the cause of death. Each testimony seemed to add another brick to the wall of evidence against Josephine. Then Calvert called Josephine's former lady's maid, a thin woman named Agnes who had worked in the Westfield household for 2 years before the murder. Mrs. Westfield and Mr. Westfield, did they have a happy marriage? Calvert asked. Agnes hesitated, glancing at Josephine. "They had their disagreements, sir, like any couple." "Disagreements?" Calvert pressed. "Or something more, did you ever witness Mr. Westfield treating his wife unkindly?" "Objection," Cooper interjected. "Leading the witness." "Sustained," Judge Thornton ruled. "Rephrase, Mr. Calvert." Calvert nodded. "Agnes, please describe the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Westfield as you observed it." Agnes twisted her hands in her lap. "Mr. Westfield could be demanding, particular about how things should be done. Mrs. Westfield tried very hard to please him, but sometimes nothing seemed to satisfy him." "Did you ever hear Mrs. Westfield express frustration with her husband, perhaps even anger?" "She wouldn't complain, not directly," Agnes said. "But sometimes, after Mr. Westfield had been especially harsh with her, I'd find her crying in her room." Calvert's expression suggested this wasn't quite what he'd hoped for. "Did Mrs. Westfield ever speak to you about her husband's will or his financial arrangements?" "No, sir. Never." "What about the night of October 18th? Did you see or hear anything unusual?" Agnes shook her head. "I had the evening off. I wasn't in the house." When it was Cooper's turn to cross-examine, he approached Agnes with a gentle smile. "Agnes, in your time working for the Westfields, did you ever see Mrs. Westfield display a violent temper? Did she ever strike anyone or break things in anger?" "No, sir. Never anything like that. She was always very controlled, even when Mr. Westfield was at his worst." "And how would you describe Mr. Westfield's behavior toward his wife? Was he loving, respectful?" Agnes looked uncomfortable. "He could be cold, controlling. He didn't like her to go out without him, didn't approve of most of her friends. He checked the household accounts every day and questioned every purchase." "Would you say he was abusive?" "Objection," Calvert called. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Cooper said smoothly. "Agnes, did you ever witness Mr. Westfield physically harming his wife?" Agnes's eyes dropped. Once, just once, I saw him grab her arm so hard it left bruises. She said she'd fallen, but I knew better. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Josephine felt Charles shift behind her, and she knew without looking that his hands would be clenched in anger. "One final question, Agnes," Cooper said. "Based on your knowledge of Mrs. Westfield's character, do you believe she was capable of murder?" Objection. Calvert was on his feet. "The witness cannot testify to the defendant's capacity for murder." Sustained, Judge Thornton ruled. "The jury will disregard the question." But Cooper had made his point. As Agnes stepped down, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. For the first time, Josephine sensed that not everyone present was convinced of her guilt. The prosecution's case continued with banking records showing that Josephine would have inherited a substantial fortune upon Harold's death, and testimony from the insurance agent who had sold Harold a life insurance policy just 3 months before his murder. By the end of the first day, Josephine was exhausted. As the guards prepared to take her back to the detention center, Charles caught her hand briefly. "It's going well," he whispered. "Cooper knows what he's doing." Josephine nodded, too tired to argue. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of evidence against her seemed overwhelming. The second day of the trial began with the prosecution's final witness, Detective Harker, who detailed how he had tracked Josephine across the country to Whisper Creek. "And when you confronted the defendant," Calvert asked, "what was her reaction?" "She seemed resigned," Harker said. "She didn't protest or try to run again." "Would you say that indicated a consciousness of guilt?" Objection, Cooper called. "Calls for speculation." Sustained. When Cooper cross-examined Harker, he focused on the detective's investigation or lack thereof into alternative suspects. "Detective Harker, did you investigate Harold Westfield's business associates after his death?" Harker shifted uncomfortably. "We looked into his banking relationships, yes." "Specifically, did you investigate Councilman George Preston or Judge William Holloway and their financial dealings with the deceased?" "I was not aware of any particular connection between Mr. Westfield and those gentlemen." "Really?" Cooper raised an eyebrow. "Even though they were partners in an investment group that had recently experienced unexplained financial losses. Even though Councilman Preston was seen arguing with Mr. Westfield at his club the very afternoon before the murder." Harker's expression hardened. "Our investigation focused on the most obvious suspect, the deceased's wife, who fled the scene and had the most to gain from his death." "In other words," Cooper pressed, "once you decided Mrs. Westfield was guilty, you stopped looking for other possibilities." "Objection," Calvert called. "Argumentative." "Withdrawn," Cooper said, but the damage was done. Several jurors were frowning thoughtfully, and one was openly glaring at Harker. When the prosecution rested its case, Cooper called his first witness, a clerk from Harold Westfield's bank, who testified that large sums had indeed been withdrawn from accounts controlled by Westfield, Preston, and Holloway in the weeks before the murder. "And where did this money go?" Cooper asked. "To an account in the name of James Smith at First Mercantile Bank of Chicago," the clerk replied. "And who controlled this account?" "According to the signature card, James Smith." "But the handwriting on the withdrawal slips matches samples of Harold Westfield's handwriting that we keep on file." This testimony caused a stir in the courtroom, with reporters scribbling furiously and spectators whispering to each other. Judge Thornton had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. The afternoon brought Cooper's key witness, a stable hand named Thomas who had worked at a livery near the Westfield home. "Thomas, were you working on the evening of October 18, 1875? Cooper asked. "Yes, sir. Until midnight." "Did you see anyone unusual that evening? Anyone visiting the Westfield home?" Thomas nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. A tall gentleman in a fine coat. He came on horseback around 8 o'clock and tied his horse at the post outside the Westfield house." "Did you recognize this gentleman?" "Not at first, sir. But when he turned to go up the walk, the street lamp caught his face and I saw the scar on his jaw. That's when I knew it was Councilman Preston. I'd seen him at political rallies." Approximately how long did Councilman Preston stay at the Westfield home? About an hour, sir. He left in quite a hurry, didn't even properly secure his horse, just jumped on and galloped off. And what time was this? Just after 9, sir. I remember because the church bells had just rung the hour. Cooper turned to the jury. Just after 9 o'clock, the time the coroner established as the approximate time of Harold Westfield's death. Calvert's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to suggest that Thomas was mistaken about the identity of the visitor or had been paid to lie. But the young man stuck to his story, and his simple, straightforward manner seemed to impress the jury. The final day of the trial brought the moment Josephine had been dreading her own testimony. As she took the stand and swore to tell the truth, she felt as if every eye in the courtroom was boring into her soul. Cooper led her gently through her account of her marriage to Harold, his controlling behavior, and the events of the night of October 18th. Josephine spoke clearly, her voice growing stronger as she described finding Harold already dead in his study and her panic at the realization of how it would appear. "I knew no one would believe me," she said, her eyes moving from Cooper to the jury. "Harold had isolated me from everyone. He controlled every aspect of our lives. Who would believe that I hadn't finally snapped and killed him? So I ran. It was wrong, I know that now, but I was terrified." When Calvert rose for cross-examination, his manner was coldly precise. He hammered at inconsistencies in her story, emphasized her financial motive, and repeatedly returned to her flight as evidence of guilt. "If you were innocent, Mrs. Westfield," he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism, "why didn't you simply stay and explain what happened? Why run halfway across the country and assume a false name?" Josephine met his gaze steadily. "Have you ever been truly afraid, Mr. Calvert? Not just concerned or worried, but bone-deep terrified. That's how I felt that night. I wasn't thinking clearly. I only knew that my husband was dead, his blood was on my hands from when I tried to help him, and everyone would believe I had killed him. So I ran." Calvert's expression suggested he wasn't moved by her explanation. "One final question, Mrs. Westfield. Did you kill your husband?" "No," Josephine said, her voice firm and clear. "I did not kill Harold. Despite everything, I would never have taken his life." As she returned to her seat, Josephine caught Charles's eye. His expression was one of such pride and love that she felt tears threaten. Whatever the outcome of the trial, she knew now that she wasn't alone, and that knowledge gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. Calvert emphasized the physical evidence, the financial motive, and Josephine's flight as proof of her guilt. Cooper countered with the testimony about Harold's embezzlement, Preston's visit to the house on the night of the murder, and the absence of any history of violence in Josephine's character. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Cooper concluded, "the prosecution asks you to believe that a gentle, educated young woman suddenly transformed into a cold-blooded killer. I ask you instead to consider a more plausible scenario that Harold Westfield was killed by a business associate he had defrauded, and that his wife, finding him dead and knowing how it would appear, panicked and fled. Not the actions of a guilty woman, perhaps, but certainly the actions of a frightened one. I ask you to return the only verdict consistent with the evidence and with justice, not guilty." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Josephine waited in a small room adjacent to the courtroom with Charles and Cooper for company. They spoke little, the tension too great for casual conversation. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Josephine felt as if her heart might stop. Back in the courtroom, the foreman, a middle-aged shopkeeper with kind eyes, rose as Judge Thornton asked for the verdict. "On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Josephine Elizabeth Westfield, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors, eager to file their stories. Spectators buzzed with excitement or disappointment, depending on their views. Josephine sat frozen, unable to quite believe what she had heard. "You're free," Charles whispered, reaching across the barrier to take her hand. "It's over." It wasn't until Judge Thornton officially dismissed the case and the bailiff announced that she was free to go that the reality began to sink in. Josephine rose on shaky legs, turning to Cooper. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." The lawyer smiled, his stern face softening. "Seeing justice done is payment enough, Mrs. Westfield, though I wouldn't object to an invitation to the wedding should there be one." Josephine blushed and Charles laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to chase away the last shadows of fear from her heart. Outside the courthouse, a light rain was falling, washing the city streets clean. Charles held an umbrella over them as they descended the steps, ignoring the reporters who shouted questions. A carriage waited at the curb. Charles had arranged it in hopes of a favorable verdict. "Where to?" he asked as they settled inside. Josephine looked out at the city where she had known such unhappiness. "Anywhere but here," she said softly. "I want to go home." Charles smiled, understanding immediately what she meant. "To Whisper Creek then," she nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "To Whisper Creek, to start again." He tilted her face up to his. "I meant what I said, you know, about the house I'm building. It's for us if you want it to be." "Are you asking me something, Dr. Morgan?" Josephine teased gently. Charles laughed. "Not very well, apparently." He took her hand, his expression growing serious. "Josephine Blackwood, I've loved you since the first day you walked into my office. Will you marry me?" The answer was simple, now that there were no more secrets between them, no more shadows from the past. "Yes," she said, feeling as if a great weight had finally lifted from her heart. "Yes, I will." Their return to Whisper Creek caused quite a stir. The small frontier town had followed the trial through telegraphed newspaper reports, and opinions were divided on Josephine's guilt or innocence. But the verdict and Charles's unwavering support carried considerable weight, and most people were willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. The doctor's practice had been maintained in his absence by a retired physician from a neighboring town, but patients were relieved to have Charles back. To everyone's surprise, Josephine resumed her position as his assistant, refusing to be cowed by whispers or sidelong glances. "Are you sure about this?" Charles asked on her first day back. "People will talk." Josephine straightened the instruments on the tray with careful precision. "People always talk, Charles, but I'm not hiding anymore. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't act as if I have." Her quiet dignity in the face of gossip gradually won over even the most skeptical townspeople. By the time winter arrived, blanketing Whisper Creek in snow, Josephine had regained much of the respect she had earned before her past caught up with her. The house Charles had begun building before their journey to St. Louis was completed in November, a comfortable two-story home at the edge of town, with a wide porch and plenty of rooms for the family they both hoped to have. They were married there on Christmas Eve, with Jonathan Cooper making the journey from St. Louis to attend, as promised. It was a simple ceremony, with only a few close friends in attendance. Josephine wore a gown of ivory silk, not white, which would have felt dishonest given her previous marriage, but not somber either. It was a dress for a new beginning, for hope and second chances. As they spoke their vows before the minister, with snow falling gently outside the windows and a fire crackling in the hearth, Josephine felt a sense of peace she had never expected to know again. "I, Charles, take you, Josephine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Charles said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." When it was her turn, Josephine looked up into the eyes of the man who had believed in her when no one else would, who had risked everything to stand by her side. "I, Josephine, take you, Charles, to be my lawfully wedded husband," she said, her voice clear and strong. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and as Charles kissed her, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, two people who had found in each other not just love, but redemption. Spring came early to Whisper Creek in 1877. By March, the snow had melted and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the mountains. The prairie began to green, and wildflowers dotted the landscape with splashes of color. Josephine planted a garden behind their house, vegetables for their table and flowers for beauty. Charles built her a small greenhouse where she could nurture seedlings protected from the sometimes harsh Dakota weather. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I've been thinking," Charles said one such evening, his arm around Josephine's shoulders. "The practice is doing too well for just the two of us to manage. I've been considering taking on an apprentice, someone young who wants to learn medicine." Josephine nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. The town is growing and you're often called away to the outlying ranches. An apprentice could help with the simpler cases." "There's another reason," Charles added, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I thought perhaps in a few months you might want to reduce your hours at the office." Josephine turned to look at him, puzzled. "Why would I want to do that?" Charles's smile was tender as he placed a hand gently on her abdomen. "Because I've noticed certain symptoms, Dr. Morgan, morning sickness, fatigue, a certain glow about you." Josephine's eyes widened. She had noticed the changes in her body but had been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that such happiness could be hers after everything she had endured. "You think I'm with child?" "Yes, I do, though we should probably confirm my diagnosis more formally." Tears filled Josephine's eyes, tears of joy and wonder and a touch of fear. "A baby," she whispered. "Our baby." Charles gathered her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The first of many, I hope, if that's what you want." "It is," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A family, our family." The examination the next day confirmed what they both already knew. Josephine was approximately 2 months pregnant, with the baby due in late October. The timing seemed fitting, somehow a new life to replace the painful memories of that October night nearly 2 years earlier. As spring turned to summer, and summer to early fall, Josephine's body changed, her slender form softening and rounding with the new life growing within her. Charles was endlessly attentive, insisting she rest when she was tired, preparing special tonics to ease her occasional nausea, and reading every medical text he could find on pregnancy and childbirth. Their happiness was complete when, on a crisp October morning with the leaves turning gold outside their window, Josephine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Hope, a simple name that embodied everything the child represented to them. As Josephine held her daughter for the first time, marveling at the tiny, perfect features and the wisp of dark hair that promised to be as rich as her own, she felt a sense of wonder that such joy could come after such sorrow. Charles sat beside them on the bed, his expression one of awe as he touched his daughter's tiny hand with a finger that seemed enormous by comparison. "She's perfect," he whispered, "just like her mother." Josephine looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears and love. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For believing in me, for promising that knowing my past wouldn't make you hate me, for keeping that promise." Charles leaned down to kiss her gently. "Loving you has been the easiest promise I've ever kept," he said. "And loving our daughter will be even easier." As little Hope wrapped her tiny fingers around her father's thumb, Josephine knew that her long journey from fear to freedom was complete. The shadows of the past would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was love, the love of the good man beside her, the love of the child in her arms, and the love of the life they were building together in this small frontier town that had become, against all odds, her true home. In the years that followed, the Morgans' happiness only deepened. Hope was joined by a brother, Joshua, 2 years later, and then by twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, in 1880. Charles's medical practice flourished, with his apprentice eventually becoming a partner. Josephine divided her time between helping at the office, managing their growing household, and teaching at the town school 1 day a week, sharing her love of literature and history with the children of Whisper Creek. The town itself grew and prospered, with a railroad spur bringing increased commerce and new settlers. By 1885, Whisper Creek boasted a proper school building, 3 churches, a bank, and even a small library that Josephine had helped establish. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and Charles was finishing his patient notes at his desk, Josephine would take out the newspaper clipping she had carried with her from St. Louis, the only tangible reminder of her former life. She kept it not out of morbid fascination, but as a reminder of how far she had come, of the strength she had found within herself when faced with the darkest of circumstances. Once, Charles found her looking at it, her expression thoughtful as she traced the faded print with her finger. "Does it still haunt you?" he asked softly, sitting beside her on the settee. Josephine shook her head. "Not haunt exactly. It's more like reading about someone else's life now, a woman I used to know but have outgrown." Charles took the clipping gently from her hands and set it aside, replacing it with his own warm grasp. "You know what I think when I remember that time?" "What?" "I think about how lucky I am that you walked into my office that day. How fortunate that of all the towns in all the West, you chose Whisper Creek." Josephine smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "Not luck, Charles, providence. I was meant to find you." As they sat together in the warm glow of the lamp, listening to the peaceful sounds of their sleeping children and the distant murmur of the creek that had given their town its name, Josephine knew that she had found more than just safety or absolution in this place. She had found her true self, the woman she was always meant to be. "If you knew what I've done, you'd hate me," she had told Charles once in a moment of fear and doubt. "I know what you've done," he had replied, taking off his hat and promising otherwise. "You survived." And survive she had not just to exist, but to thrive, to love, to build a life rich with purpose and joy. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for on that blood-red evening when she had first arrived in Whisper Creek, dust on her boots and fear in her heart. It was, Josephine thought as Charles drew her close for a kiss, everything.